worried about this a long time. Let us be clear. This is not a war on terrorism. Terrorism is an activity. This is a struggle with radical Islamists in both their militant and their stealth form. The militant form believe in using military power in one form or another. The stealth form believes in using cultural, intellectual, and political, but their end goal is exactly the same. The fight against Sharia and the madrasas and mosques which teach hatred and fanaticism is the heart of the enemy movement from which the terrorists spring forth. And it's time we had a national debate on this, and one of the things I'm going to suggest today is a federal law which says no court anywhere in the United States under any circumstance is allowed to consider Sharia as a replacement for American law, period. And let me draw a sharp distinction between those Muslims who live in the modern world and those Muslims who would radically change the modern world. Radical Islamists want to impose Sharia on all of us for legitimate reasons. And let me be quite clear. You can respect your adversary without agreeing or giving in. They have profound, deeply held beliefs, and one of the great challenges for secularists is they can't understand the level of passion that a belief which is derived from an underlying religious form leads one to have. Which is why, frankly, deeply believing Christian and Jewish Americans have a much better understanding of what's going on than do secular intellectuals in deracinated universities looking out of their ivory tower, trying to wonder what it is that would lead people to kill themselves and having no comprehension of the emotions and the depth of passion engaged. So, stealth jihadists use political, cultural, societal, religious, intellectual tools. Violent jihadists use violence. But in fact, they're both engaged in jihad. And they're both seeking to impose the same end state, which is to replace Western civilization with a radical imposition of Sharia. And let me be quite clear. And I could not disagree more with Dean Kagan in accepting the Saudi money to have professors of Sharia at Harvard. I couldn't disagree more with every university in America which teaches a transparently propagandistic version. Sharia in its natural form has principles and punishments totally abhorrent to the Western world, and the underlying basic belief, which is that law comes directly from God and is therefore imposed upon humans, and no human can change the law without it being an act of apostasy, is a fundamental violation of a tradition in the Western system which goes back to Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem, and which has evolved and given us freedom across the planet on a scale we can hardly imagine, and which is now directly threatened by those who would impose it. So, let me be also quite clear that the rules are radical and horrific. And I think, again, it's fascinating that even when people go out and do polling and they say to, for example, Muslims in general, do you believe in Sharia, they don't then explain what Sharia is. So Sharia becomes like, would you like to be a Rotarian? And it sounds okay. And let me give you an example that was on the news. I was doing Fox and Friends this morning, and coming across was that Iran, in trying to appease world opinion, has graciously agreed that a woman who'd been convicted of adultery would not be stoned to death. She'd be hung. And that was the moderation. I know you can't make these things up. I say to all of our friends on the left who believe in gay rights, the principle of Sharia is painful execution, not just death, painful execution. And how we don't have some kind of movement in this country on the left that understands that Sharia is a direct mortal threat to virtually every value that the left has is really one of the most interesting historical questions and will someday lead many dissertations to being written. So, I think we are faced, when you recognize, for example, that Sharia requires 4 male witnesses to rape, And in the absence of 4 male witnesses, the complainant is themselves guilty. And there's a case in the last year in Saudi Arabia of a woman who was gang raped, had no witnesses, and has since been beaten for having engaged in inappropriate behavior. Now, if you think I'm making this up, one of the things we're going to post at my personal scholar site at American Enterprise, which is aei.org, right? I always get confused between com and org, so I got to check with Brady. Is a case in New Jersey, which is, I mean, I ran across this in preparing the speech, and I was so astounded I didn't believe it. And Brady got the actual appeals court ruling, which we're going to post. A woman files for a restraint against her husband, who has been beating her, torturing her, and raping her for hours at a time. And the judge rules at the entry level that he's not guilty of any criminal actions because, in fact, in his interpretation of Sharia, those are his rights, and therefore would be an imposition on his religion to apply to him American law. The appeals court came back and cited the 1878 case involving polygamy and said, this is nonsense. We have a clear, long tradition in this country that you can't, in fact, interpose religion to commit criminal acts and claim that it was because your religion made you do it. But when you read the case, and I believe this man was sincere. This is not an evil man. This is a person who has found a rationale for a behavior system which is horrific and which we would never tolerate. And yet here is an American judge so confused by secular situation ethics that he was unwilling to impose American law on somebody who was clearly abusing somebody. Now, there are much less horrific examples of this. I would cite to you, for example, the case in Minnesota where a blind student was exempted from a course and given credit without attending because his seeing eye dog offended Muslim students. Now, the fact that the college didn't have the nerve to say, under the Americans with Disability Act, the blind student stays, and if you want to leave, that's your prerogative. If you want to know what appeasement is like in America, if you want to know why this is a problem here at home, this is the kind of stuff that's going on because nobody in our secular elites is prepared to stand up and defend Western civilization against a routine, steady erosion. Now, this is, I know, by the standards of the administration, radical language, and people say you shouldn't talk like this, but here's what a 2008 U.S. Central Command Red Team report said. It concluded that we are only doing ourselves a disservice when we ignore the theological foundations of many violent concepts, including jihad. Quote, the U.S. government should resist the urge to consider itself capable of managing the emotional responses of those whom we engage, either militarily or diplomatically, on issues as serious as the Islamic concept of jihad, misunderstood or not. We must not avoid criticism of the topic if the intent is only to assuage the sensibilities of nonviolent Muslims who will remain nonviolent in the face of an intellectual examination and critique of the theological underpinnings and or assertions of jihad. We should avoid, this is in bold in their writing, we should avoid readily accepting the notion that criticism or notice of an Islamic tenet such as jihad by the U.S. government is tantamount to the demonization of all Muslims or Islam. So in the tradition of the Red Team at the U.S. Central Command, and I've served on the Transformation Advisory Group at the U.S. Central Command, let me just say, or the Joint Forces Command rather, let me just say I believe that it is very important to draw a distinction between radical jihadists, which I define simply, those people who seek to impose Sharia, and those Muslims who seek to practice their religion within a framework of the modern world. And I would allow each Muslim to define themselves in that sense. But I would be unequivocal about the fact that radical Islamists are not compatible with the modern world and not compatible with civilization as we know it, and therefore we are engaged in a long struggle. Now you can see the confusion, the notion that 2 + 2 must equal something other than 4. When you read, for example, Army Chief of Staff George Casey's comment about the terrorist at Fort Hood. This is what he said. This is, again, Chief of Staff of the Army, and a smart man, and a man who served ably and patriotically in Iraq. But a man who clearly had been captured, at least for the moment, by the forces of political correctness. Quote, "We have to be careful because we can't jump to conclusions now based on little snippets of information that come out. And frankly, I'm not worried, but I'm concerned about this increased speculation." Now, they were dealing with somebody, and ironically, you later have a letter from Senators Lieberman and Collins saying to them, "Why did you not notice the degree to which this person was a radicalized Islamist?" This is a man who's carrying a card in his wallet that says he's a soldier of Islam. But we wouldn't want to jump to conclusions. If you watch the administration, every time there's a new problem, we don't know the motivation. I mean, how often can you say this? And I'm going to bring you back to that later, because there have been 54 people arrested in this country, not overseas, in this country, since Obama became president. About each of which the administration said, with newfound ignorance and wonder, "I wonder why they're doing this." Now, the more amazing case, and the clearest proof of the willful blindness of the Obama administration, is the Detroit Christmas Day bomber. When his father in Nigeria reported concern over his son's radicalization. Again, his father goes in to see the CIA, and his father is a well-known and respected banker who cares enough about the United States to try to help us. And he says that his son had been radicalized and he was afraid he had disappeared, and he thought he might have gone off to a terrorist training camp, and he recommended that the U.S. government not give him a visa. Now you would think 31 years after Tehran, 9 years after 9/11, all the money we've spent, all the reports, the 9/11 Commission, the Director of National Intelligence, the creation of the Homeland Security Department, somewhere in that process they would have said, you know, if somebody's dad says they're a terrorist, maybe the burden of proof ought to be on them. But that would violate the Attorney General's principle that American criminal law applies to everybody on the planet, and therefore the burden's on the American government. You'll see how this works out in a minute. So the young man's name was added to the 500,000 names in a computer database in McLean, and quote, largely forgotten. This is from the Washington Post, and largely forgotten. The lack of attention was not unusual, according to U.S. intelligence officials. That's the Post version. Now, when it's pointed out, after the passengers have figured out he's a bomber, after he's arrested, after they read him his Miranda rights, which he doesn't have, no foreigner has Miranda rights, and no combatant against the United States, including American citizens, has Miranda rights. If you're a combatant against the United States, you are by definition a traitor, and therefore you are not covered under Miranda. This is one of the great falsehoods of the Holder Justice Department and the Obama administration. John Brennan, the President's senior advisor on Homeland Security, goes on television and says the following, quote, "Well, first of all, there was no single piece of intelligence, a smoking gun, if you will, that said that he was going to carry out his attack against that aircraft." Now you want to say that to Brennan, if his father came in to see the CIA because he was worried his son was a terrorist, what more do you need? And of course it's like the other cases I told you about. There will never be enough evidence for Brennan to believe it, just as there will never be enough evidence for Holder to decide that these are enemies and not merely innocent victims somehow trapped in the American system. Senator Lieberman and Collins wrote, quote, this is to the Department of Justice, I believe, in the Department of Defense. This is a letter they sent. "We have repeatedly sought your department's cooperation for more than 5 months. Our efforts have been met with delay, the production of little that was not already publicly available, and shifting reasons for why the departments are withholding the documents and witnesses that we have requested." This is about Fort Hood. "Given the warnings about Major Nidal Malik Hassan's extreme radicalism, why was he not stopped before he took 13 American lives?" And that was Lieberman and Collins. Now, I want to compare the total confusion of the Obama administration and their senior appointees, who are shocked anew every time there's a crisis, with the clarity of Franklin Delano Roosevelt,